Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Burnout, a term which is commonly used to describe utter mental, physical, and emotional exhaustion because of life moving too fast and an individual's workload being too much. For a very long time, this term was being taken as an excuse for people being lazy or tired. But just today, the World Health Organization has recognized burnout as a medical condition. This is huge because burnout essentially is a symptom of a larger problem, the problem being our lifestyles. To recognize it as a medical condition gives us all the opportunity to take a step back and evaluate the cultural and economic paradigm shift that has taken place in the past decade, resulting in such drastic changes in how we live our lives. On tonight's show, we discuss the lifestyle choices we make and those we are forced to live by. We further discuss how globalization is importing and exporting cultural values and how that shapes our social relations today. Joining us to explore this topic today is Mr. Sohail Hashmi, who's a historian joining us from Delhi. We're also joined by Mr. Felipe Nogueira, who's an anthropologist joining us from Brazil. We're also joined by Dr. Aladdin Assaiqeli, who's an educationalist and a professor of linguistic and communication studies at the University of Palestine, joining us from Kuala Lumpur. Thank you all for joining us. Mr. Felipe, let me begin with you. So I described burnout here, the condition of utter exhaustion, and something that has become a characterization of our generation and at large the population today. In your opinion, what do you think are the main social causes which cause for rapid burnout today?
Well, technology has changed a lot the way we work. There is a conception of technology as a way to extend our limits, our human limits. But since we extend our human limits, also our work is extended. We must follow the pace of the technology, and then we start being treated like a machine, like a technology. Then we have to be productive. We have to keep up with the pace of technology, of the production, in a job market that is demanding more and more of us nowadays.
Right.
And then,
right. And do you think that this expectation that has arisen of humans to keep up with this fast pace of technology is unnatural?
Yes, definitely unnatural, because in a traditional society, work was dictated mostly by a natural rhythm. There were like a rhythm to be followed. Nowadays, it's not like that. We have a flexibility of work created by technology, and then, for example, in education, there is a trap of a flexibility, because you could work all day and then you could study in a flexible way using technology. But it doesn't work always like that, and people get overwhelmed because they assume more responsibility than they can, in an illusion that with technology they could keep up with everything. But we have our natural rhythm, and we can't keep up with everything, even if we have technology to assist us to extend these limits.
Right. And you mentioned here how a person becomes overwhelmed. One of the things that has always been a way to vent out that feeling of being overwhelmed is through recreational activities. And this is a question I'm going to take to Mr. Sohail Hashmi. Mr. Sohail Hashmi, we talk a lot about development these days and a lot about rural to urban migration. With that, we know that city centers, as busy as they are with the development that's happening, they don't leave a lot of room for recreational spaces. Do you think that impacts human health?
Well, this whole thing of globalization, it has actually taken away not only the spaces for recreation, it has not left any time for recreation. And in third world countries like us, like you, young men, young women, they are working in time schedules which work which run in accordance with the time schedule of the developed West. So we have people working through the nights. Their biological cycles are totally destroyed. During the daytime, when they would come back from, people would work from morning to evening and come back, and they'll have time in the evenings and afternoons or at night to be with themselves, with their family, to enjoy, go out, to have Sundays off, Saturdays off. All that is gone now. You are supposed to be working 24 hours. And what this great globalization, great development that has done is to snatch away the hard won rights of people all over the world to work for 8 hours, to rest for 8 hours, to have 8 hours at their own disposal.
Right.
This is what has totally gone. So even if you have spaces for recreation, who's going to be there?
Right. The mental exhaustion that people face after working so much, even if they have time for recreation, they can't really utilize that because they are so exhausted. Dr. Aladdin, with what Mr. Sohail Hashmi talked about here, when we're talking about exhaustion, when we're talking about overwork, we're talking about technological progress. How do you think that has fundamentally changed the way we communicate today with each other, with our family, with our social circles?
Well, yeah, technology has changed the way we communicate with one another, whether our intimate, close friends, or even, people from far places. Technology has brought, many ways of communicating with one another. But in this context, the downside, I would say, of such, technological devices is it has affected, these technological devices have affected, probably the intimacy that would be created using traditional means of communication. Using these social media apps, sites, have isolated us from such intimacy. We talk about things from, like, now we are talking, you are in a place and I'm in a place, but this is fine. But when it comes to close people, relatives, I think technology has deprived us of the intimate feelings that would result from...
Right. Doctor, you mean here that when we're with close people, we're still deprived of the intimacy? When we're in the same, for example, let's say the same room as our family, how does technology hinder intimacy there?
We could be in the same room, as you said, but each member of the family is using, his or her technological device, whether this is a mobile phone or a tablet or any other of these, devices. We are in the same space, in the same place, whether it's a room, it's the bus. Previously, I used to make many friends on the bus. Whenever I go downtown and take the bus, I would, by the end of the journey, I would, befriend 2 or 3 people, or at least one. But nowadays, you see people sitting side by side, and each one is absorbed completely in his or her mobile phone or tablet. It is unnatural, really.
Right. So, Dr. Aladdin, you've highlighted a very important here, how it's unnatural that we lack the intimacy that we had before. Our ways of socializing have changed. Now, you've highlighted the change here, but my question is this change necessarily bad? Because it's adjusting to the development, it's adjusting to the larger global phenomena of change that we're engulfed by. So, is it bad or is it just different?
It is not necessarily bad. Well, there are advantages, of course, and there are disadvantages. So talking about the disadvantages in this context is, I would again focus on the word intimacy. Our communication nowadays seems to be artificial, hypocritical, not the kind of real, honest communication. It's all showing off.
Right. And hold on to that point while I go back to Felipe and ask him that both Mr. Sohail Hashmi and Dr. Aladdin here highlighted two important points. One was that our time for leisure has decreased, and one that even when we do have time for leisure, the way we communicate has decreased our intimacy. Now, from your point of view, how important are both leisure and intimacy for human beings?
The subject of intimacy is really important. It's possible to create a really some bonds online. A lot of people make some friendships online, but they have to cross the border of not only staying online talking to them, but to meet personally. I have seen that the communication technology creates an artificial community. Example, you see people who get engaged in something just online. We never see them personally. They don't compromise. They don't have a commitment to anything because they can hide online. But on the other hand, it's possible to find people with common faces who share interests, and that would be a good side of communication technology.
Right. And that is something that people often say is one of the main benefits of social media, that you can link yourself up to people who are like-minded. And that might have not necessarily been possible if you went through the more organic route there. Is that true? Is that something you would agree with as well?
Yeah. The technology, the communication nowadays with technology has given us this opportunity to find people with common interests, to share the interests, and create communities. But I guess people still have to adapt to this new way of creating communities. It's something totally new. Sometimes we don't know people very well. They can be dangerous people, even. And I think we are yet to learn a way that some people say maybe inadequate.
Right. And Mr. Philip, you said that sense of community has disintegrated. Mr. Hashmi, we know that South Asian cultures for a very, very long time have been hailed and have been appreciated for the fact that they prioritize community ties, family ties. Do you feel in the last decade that has changed?
Well, as has been said just now, that you can have people sitting in one room and everybody is playing with their own little gadget. It is increasingly happening all over. And simultaneously, there is something else happening, which is a strange kind of disconnected existence. And this is coupled with this need to update your status. So you are constantly trying to show the world where you are. You see a lynching on the road. You don't intervene to stop it. You film it and you share it with your friends. And this is happening all over. There is a fire in a hotel, there is an accident. People are making videos of that and sharing it.
Right.
If they did not have this, they would either walk away, which is what a whole lot of people do, but at least some of them would intervene, try to intervene in the situation, try to control it.
Right. So
now,
Mr. Hashmi, building on to the point that you're saying here, that that instant need for connectivity and the instant need to share things, we'd rather share it online than actually intervene. Just to that point, we do know that in more developed nations such as the US and the UK, internet connectivity, internet users are up to almost 90%. But that might not be the case for more developing nations or those nations in the Asian sphere. For example, in India, out of the 1.37 billion population, it's expected that 627 million people will have internet connections. Now, that's not a 90% there. So do you think lifestyles are still different here?
Can I intervene here? 600 million odd people have an internet connectivity or one of these gadgets. 40% of our population is illiterate. You see the disconnect.
Right.
We don't have people who can read and write. The entire globalization thing, this whole digital revolution, they only want you to be able to have numeral literacy. You should be able to punch numbers, and that is all they need. You punch numbers and your money goes into your account. You punch number, the money goes into another account. That is all they want. They don't want people to be literate. They don't want people to take informed decisions. All decisions are being taken by them.
So who are these people who don't want this to happen? Who is that you're referring to here?
The people who run the entire global economy.
Right.
It is the big corporate houses, it is the multinationals, it is this whole connectivity. Now, I don't want to walk out of my house to the shop across the road. I'm buying stuff from Amazon. This connectivity is destroying an entire lifestyle. All the shopkeepers, all the small street, neighborhood stores, they are all dying because of this connectivity. Right. I don't know in whose benefit it is. It is certainly not in the benefit of those people.
And on that point, Mr. Hashmi, hold on to that thought. I want to ask Dr. Aladdin here that the point that Mr. Hashmi highlighted, connectivity, and he's alluding towards the corporate agenda behind this, to connect people, but not to let them actually connect amongst themselves. Would you agree with that? Do you think that a large part of what's happening today, the corporations are to blame?
Well, I think I would agree with this view. Technology has affected all of us. By the way, whether we are Asians or Westerns or Africans, every home has been almost affected, maybe to varying degrees. Corporations, I suppose, can or ought to be blamed because we are meant to become, addicts to these gadgets. It's addiction. Cyber addiction, technological addiction. Once we are addicted to these devices, we become disconnected really from one another. Family ties, as I said, the members of the same family, the relations, the communication has affected our relations. Mr. Hashmi mentioned one point. All you need is numbers nowadays, rather than other types of literacy. But in addition to numbers, what is needed nowadays is visual literacy, visual communication. So yes, you might be illiterate in the traditional sense of literacy, being able to read and write, but you still can use these devices because there is a great element of visual or visualization.
And expand upon that idea a little more for us, Dr. Aladdin, the visual representation, how it's increasing and the need for it. Why is it so important?
The whole semiotic landscape is changing nowadays. Previously, it was solely linguistic. Communication was linguistic in nature, but nowadays the visual element is increasing in communication, and this is because of these changes in the technology, the screen technologies. So less reliance is becoming on the verbal, ways of communicating, and more reliance is on visuals, visual communication. But this is not to say that visual communication is negative or that linguistic communication is bad.
It's just a change.
Yeah, it's just a change resulting from this, digital revolution.
Right.
So it's a shift. It's a semiotic shift in the way we communicate. Right. Where the visual turn is taking, a more prominent role now in communication.
Right, and Dr. Aladdin, that's the point that I want to go back to, come back to later on. But before we move on to that, I want to ask Mr. Felipe. Now, something that Dr. Aladdin mentioned here is that social media and these internet platforms, we're meant to be addicted to them, and science proves that dopamine is released when users use them often. Now, couple that with the fact that costs are rising, humans have to work longer hours just to maintain decent living, just decent lifestyles. That with the fact that social media that is out there, we are meant to be addicted to it. Do you think humans are fighting a losing war here? Do you think there's any hope?
Yeah, the internet, social media mostly is meant to be addictive. I think there's something really, really bad which is being created nowadays, which is a shock culture. Like you have to show your life to everyone. You have to make something shocking to people, and that creates an addictive culture. If you remember those last cases, the shootings at schools, everything related to this shock culture. And I think maybe we should find new ways to get to be, to be entertained, to find some kind of leisure that is not inside of this addictive culture of the internet only. Of course, communicating on the internet may be important, but I think we should also find new meanings, new things.
Right. But given our lifestyles, do you think it's possible to find ways, to find mediums of new meaning, to find activities that give us more meaning?
Yeah, I've seen a trend nowadays on the internet which is related to sports. There has been many pages related to sports nowadays, but pages not only to share the sports news, the big sports, but sports, motivational pages, if I call it so, but which encourages people to develop themselves through sports, not only sports, but a personal growth too. They share philosophy. Maybe this is a way to create a new meanings in life, which internet can help this way.
Right. And Mr. Hashmi, when we're talking finding more meaning in our lifestyles, do you think that us belonging to South Asia and our culture, some rituals, tradition that has for so long given us meaning, we are losing our ties to it?
Absolutely. And the question, Michelle, that you were asking just now, whether there is a way out, I think all of us educated people, we have to take these decisions. For example, we have to decide that we will stop ordering on Amazon. We have to decide that we will take a short walk, go across end of the street and buy the provisions that we need. We have to take a decision that we will not go to a gym, but we will go out and jog on the street. That we will not update our status every 15 seconds, but walk down to the neighborhood park and sit and talk to people. It is just this. We start taking this decision, suddenly you will see that there is an alternative world that exists. We have just closed our eyes to it.
Right. But the measures you're mentioning here, Mr. Hashmi, they seem to be on an individualistic level. And while they might help us as individuals, do you think they're enough to heal society?
Well, all of us have taken the individual decision to succumb to this need to constantly update our status. Why do we, the moment if you do not receive a phone call for 15 minutes, or you don't get an SMS from somebody, you start thinking that the world has forgotten you. And immediately you start fiddling with your phone. Why isn't nobody calling me?
Right.
This insecurity, that this constant need to be connected to the world. What is the great need?
Right.
Why does the entire world need to know that you are going for a bath?
Right.
or
And
that you have just finished a bath.
right. And Mr. Hashmi, something that you alluded towards here and something that you've pointed out, I'm going to put my last question to Dr. Aladdin here. It seems that the individual self has become the center of everything we do. Before it was community, before it was family, but now it's individualism that is becoming the highlighted part of everything, all our social interactions. Do you think that in the future this is just going to increase?
Uh, Given these technological devices that have actually, separated us from one another, isolated us from one another, though we might be in the same space, I suppose yes, the tendency is going to increase. This is coupled with, a sense of, showing off. Um, we like, to be liked by others, to be viewed by others, which, by the way, has shattered, privacy. I think the word privacy now is an old-fashioned word. No one is talking about the privacy. Everything is being, online. This is, a daily reality.
Right.
But this has to be regulated. This has to be, rethought about, and it all starts, I think, from the family. The
Right.
challenge is big, actually. The
Right.
challenge is big, but we have to,
Right. And
yes.
Dr. Aladdin, you've stated a strong point here that with everything that's happening, the important part is that it should be regulated, that we shouldn't forget what creates meaning in life. And with that, thank you, Dr. Aladdin, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Nogueira, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Sohail Hashmi, for joining us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to continue this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Professor Samina Yasmeen, who is an analyst joining us from Australia. We're also joined by Mr. Carl Zah, who is an analyst joining us from China. Thank you both for joining us. Professor Samina Yasmeen, before we went on break, we were talking about the impact, the cultural impact of burnout. Burnout being the fact that we are completely exhausted because of our hectic lifestyles. Now, how would you see that impacting family in the modern age?
Well, I think one factor that I've noticed is that when people get burnt out, mainly what they're really doing is not focusing on what they have to do. And their mind is constantly working on other things. What it does to the family is that they're not connecting to the family members. And then there's a tendency to then keep on, say, working on the internet or looking at the screen, and that really takes them away from relating to people around them. So it creates a lot of emotional problems, and I think it also creates a disconnection or disengagement with the wider community. Another thing that I've noticed in this whole process is that, especially talking to younger people, the ones that I teach at the University of Western Australia, because they're so focused on internet, social media, constantly working, earning their living and studying, their ability to deal with their issues becomes very limited. So if they have any problems, they don't really have someone to talk to. And in fact, there's increasing data that mental unwellness is becoming a factor that we have to start dealing with. So that's a broader impact. So if you have someone who's mentally unwell or unhappy, obviously then it changes the whole dynamics within the family.
Right.
And when it changes the dynamics in the family, it changes the society.
Right. And Professor Samina, you talked about your students and how you witness them dealing with so many different things, juggling so many different things that they're not able to process their emotions. Do you also feel like the lifestyles that we've created for ourselves these days promote isolation?
Oh, definitely. Because, we need to look at it whether it's just in Pakistan or globally. I think globally there's very accepted literature that says that the more people focus on internet or the social media, the more they just focus only on that screen that they're looking at. And it does create a sense of isolation. For example, a classic comment that one of the students came up with was that she has hundreds of friends on Facebook, but when she's depressed, she doesn't have anyone to talk to. So that means she's connected and she's still very isolated. And that, again, as I had said, it contributes to a lack of wellness among people.
Right. And on that thought, Professor Samina, stay with us. I want to go Mr. Carl here. You heard Professor Samina talk about how there's an increasing amount of isolation, how family ties, how social ties are being impacted by that. I want to ask you from the lens of work. I want to read out a couple of lines from an article that was titled, "Workism is Making Americans Miserable." And I want to ask you if you can relate to any of this. Work for the college educated elite would morph into a kind of religion promising identity, transcendence, and community. Call it workism. So this idea of workism, that we're putting it on a pedestal, we think that it's everything. It's going to give us community. It's going to give us satisfaction. Do you think this is just specific to the American culture, or do you think it's happening all around, and especially in China?
Oh, that's a great question. I definitely can identify with that in United States. I work in U.S. for over 22 years, and I remember there's a saying that in U.S. we we work to live. No, we live in other places. We live to work, and in United States we work to live. In China, I think there's definitely a shift. In the old times, the family is a lot more important. But in the modern age, as it's occurring everywhere else, the work is starting to seep into every aspect of life. Now with modern technology, you are always reachable by phone, by email, by WhatsApp or WeChat. And I see that with my cousins who are in China. But at the same time, it's happening at a pace that's different from the United States. I think U.S. is a very extreme case.
How so? How do you think it's different at the pace level?
Right. So on one hand, it can be. So, for example, Alibaba has a famous 996 schedule. So 996 is you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, right? So that's pretty extreme. And that kind of work culture actually is pretty common in Asia. I mean, it started in Japan. Like this famous salaryman, they would just go to work from the morning. They will come back very late. Their social life is around work. In a way, that's also happening in China right now. A lot of because even outside of work, a lot of people who, especially in the business life, a lot of their time is spending on entertaining their clients, their would-be prospects. And that's cutting into traditional family life.
Right. Mr. Carl, it seems like all over the world that is happening, that with work taking precedence, family life is being impacted. But what do you think is driving individuals to prioritize work in this way? Is it just economics here, or is it something more?
I think it's a little bit of both. It's economic and social. Because, on one hand, people are, of course, they have to provide for their family, so they go to work. But at the same time, when your whole social life is shaped by work, as it is nowadays, that when all your coworkers are also spending all their life at work or going out together, even after work, to socialize, you are kind of compelled to do the same. Right. It's like, you'll be standing out if you choose not to participate. And that kind of generates a kind of momentum of its own.
Right. And with that question of why people feel the need to be obsessed with work or workism taking over, I want to ask Professor Samina a question related to identity. Now, identity is fundamental to any human being's existence. With the fact that we are working so hard for corporations that are so large, and the fact that we've just become cogs in the system, how do you think that impacts emotional stability?
I think it definitely does shape people's identity in the sense that you just become workaholic. And that's really what's also creating literature and experiences that people get very worn out, not really with it, burnout as we started the discussion. And it also makes them think that if they're not in a job or if they're not constantly working, somehow they are not worthwhile individuals. So people are in few companies that actually say that you only come for 3 or 4 days a week to work. They feel a lot happier, but that information doesn't get translated to ordinary people or everyday workers. And they think if they're not constantly working, somehow they're not doing their best. And in that sense, I guess what I wanted to share is experience of Australia. Because when I came to Australia years ago, it was a very different place. Weekends, people would actually go to the beach in summer, but not in winter. And they would take their times off. But now suddenly they've come into a space where people are working nonstop. And as Carl had said, because they're accessible so much, even when they're on leave, they're not really on leave. So that shapes their identity. So suddenly if they are retrenched or if they don't have the same amount of pressure on work, then they start feeling worthless. And that affects their identity.
Right.
And it occurs more for people who are actually in their 50s and 60s who are somehow seen by the wider community that they have run their use-by date.
Right. And when we're talking about burnout, it's seeming to be something that is characteristic of the millennials. But we know that the generation Z that's going to follow, they will also be experiencing this, and other generations to follow will also be experiencing this. Do you think that this feeling of losing energy at young ages will just continue and it will just get worse in the coming future?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's only a millennial issue. I think even somebody like me, I've known a lot of people, my apologies, who have actually felt burnt out. And that's because the work has got so many demands. A lot of things that were done previously by support staff who had their own jobs are not there being done for people. So you have to be your writer, you have to be the typist, you have to be the corrector, you have to be the printer, everything. So in academia, especially what I'm familiar with, people suddenly find that they're working on their own with extreme demands on their system, because also there is a lot of managerialism that's coming into the system. So with that, even people in their 50s I've seen have been feeling burnt out. But definitely the younger generation, because they're not being trained to have human connection. They're mostly just looking at the screen. And that's where their connections are being made. So they don't have that emotional relaxation. They don't have that downtime. And it does make them burn out more quickly. And that's where I just think it's so important that we start telling everyone, not just millennials, to say there are times when you have to put your mobile, your computer screen aside and just go out and look at the world outside.
Right.
But again, with one thing, I do want to say that the question about workism is very relative, because if we look at a number of Pakistani women, I don't think they work that much. Maybe because the society doesn't expect them to, but it's only the ones who are in workforce, like you and others, that do have this issue. Otherwise, I'm aware of people in Pakistan and even here who would start the day with basically nothing to do.
Right.
And that's got its own problems.
Right, of course. With that, everything is relative in this discussion, and also the amount of hours you put in. But Mr. Carl, something that we were talking about was the fact that some things are very unique to the young people these days. It's very unique for young people to feel isolated, to feel like their emotional connections have been disconnected. But we're talking from a vantage point here. Do you think young people are actually realizing the mess they are in, the emotional mess they're in?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. In China, what I've seen is, from very young age, people are spending tons of time on the internet, playing games. They do form friendship online, but it's a virtual friendship. It doesn't really compensate for the human face-to-face interaction. But people we're in a completely different age now. I think we're all in the very unknown period. We're all trying to figure out how this is all going to work out in the age of internet.
Right. And we're still figuring it out as developments take place. Thank you so much, Mr. Carl, for joining us. Thank you, Professor Samina, Yasmeen, for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you both. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.